Hi, I'm Benton Stokes.
And I'm Elane O'Rourke.
And this is Cocktail Theology.
Hi there.
Hi there.
I am so thrilled that we had this interview with my friend MichaelRay Mathews.
Yes, we've been working on this for a while.
Yeah, we've been trying to figure out how to do that and how to get him, because he's busy and we're busy, and I didn't even realize we were living in the same city. I mean, like, that's how...
Isn't that crazy?
But it meant also that, you know, in this time of COVID and shutdown, that we weren't in the same room, which was also kind of weird.
I know.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's not the way we envisioned this whole thing going down,
No,
but I think it came out really great. Why don't you tell our people a little about MichaelRay Mathews?
Right. So MichaelRay is a community organizer, a pastor, a theologian, and I would say that he's got a bit of the prophet about him. Like that ability to stand and look and see and name in a really evocative and Christian way. Mm-hmm. And I just so admire the work he's done over the last 25 years that I know of, and the kind of man of faith he is in the world, yes. Especially in these times when the white Christian world is becoming more aware of the social and personal interior oppressions we put on other folks.
Wow, yes.
I'm really glad that we got a chance to be able to talk to him.
Yeah, me too. And I had not met MichaelRay before this interview, but I felt like I had, both because you all go so far back, but also because he was pastor for 8 years of the church that I currently serve part-time, leading worship in San Jose. So it was really nice to finally kind of connect with him, and he shares in our interview a lot about his time at Grace and the things that he learned and the ways that he worked with the congregation in working out some of these issues that we're talking about. And I just have a tremendous amount of respect for that.
Well, let's listen.
Yeah,
I'm
here's
excited.
Our interview with MichaelRay Mathews.
So we were talking about how we went to seminary together, and that's how we met. We weren't at the same school, we just had a class together, and I was so impressed by you and just kind of followed along when I got the opportunity, and then dragged you to my middler. And for those of you who didn't go to the same school I did, the middler was kind of like a pre-thesis defense, if you will. You got to have another student and a teacher and a couple of things, and you talked about your journey and your direction and all of that kind of stuff. And I really found MichaelRay to be a good mirror. Maybe that's not sounding, I don't know, something like that, but I wanted him there and I wanted to have his input.
This was a lovely experience for me. It helped me think about my own journey. It helped me think about the kind of intentionality that I needed to bring to how I was discerning the call. That was a good witness for me.
Maybe you could tell our people a little bit about who you are in your journey. I do want to say that the Prophetic Resistance podcast is awesome, and I cannot recommend it enough to our folks. I was listening to episode 38 this morning, which ties into our conversation. I recommend it so much. So if you're listening to this, which of course you are, go listen to episode 38.
So a bit about me. I am the child and grandchild of the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to places in the North, the Midwest, and the West. My mom hails from Georgia, the red dirt of Georgia, red clay dirt of Georgia, and my dad from the bayou of southwestern Louisiana. They traveled from their places after my mother finished college and my dad finished serving in the Army to Los Angeles. And I was born in Hollywood on Sunset Boulevard in 1968, a few months after we lost Dr. King. And I was raised in the LA area. I grew up in the suburbs of Carson and Compton. I grew up going to private Christian schools, like white Christian, sort of evangelical, proto-evangelical schools, until I was about just before high school. And our financial situation required that I go to the public school. And I graduated high school and stayed in LA and went to the University of Southern California. I discerned my call, though, to ministry as a 12-year-old. I have a great picture of me at that age. I mean, it's a great picture. My afro looks like very tight. You can look at my face and know that there's a whole lot of other stuff going on that you need to like offer to the prayer list, but the afro is tight. But it was in that context that I first discerned a call to ministry. I had been asked to serve a leadership role, leading worship and serving as like a peer chaplain. And I fell in love with that. And I said, I want to do this kind of stuff. And I ended up telling my home church. I grew up in a large historic African-American Baptist congregation in LA that I felt a call to ministry. And that was kind of the beginning of that journey. I wrestled with it almost from the minute I said it at 12 until I was about 22, getting ready to finish college. And there's a very, very long story that goes with that. But I discerned that, all the things that were interested to me, they all could be lived out if I really took seriously this sense that the Spirit was calling me to this work. And so I worked as a campus minister at USC with the American Baptists. I later served as a youth pastor of another American Baptist congregation, a historically white congregation that was multicultural. And most of my youth were Asian, Latinx, and white. The only black kid was my little brother, who would come when he would come up from Compton to spend the weekend with his big brother. I also served my home congregation in LA as the operations manager, kind of a church administrator job. And I did that consistently for almost 8 years before I went to seminary. And so when I went to seminary, I was pretty clear that I was going to be involved in ministry that was external to the congregation, that it was going to be about social justice. I didn't know what that meant yet. That it was going to be about outreach to the community. I didn't have language for organizing, but not long after I started seminary, I got connected to a local organizer in West Oakland, because by then I was serving and worshiping with this historically black congregation in West Oakland. He took me around and showed me what organizing was about, took me to a bunch of community meetings, helped me meet like everyday grassroots leaders who were trying to make change in their community and who were doing it through a lens of faith. And I just fell in love with it. I say that organizing ruined me. And I was pretty clear that even if I took a call to be a pastor, which I was still swearing I'd never be a pastor, that I was going to see my work as pastor, my leadership as pastor, through the lens of organizing, that my job as a pastor would be about organizing the life of the congregation, helping the congregation understand its call, understand what it's hearing, and some of the same practices that are part of organizing in terms of deep relational listening and doing really good research and going deep and asking deep questions and trying to discern communally what all the information means, and then making decisions and challenging the decision makers. In this case, the decision maker is the congregation itself to live into that call. So after I finished seminary and served a few more years with this church in Oakland, I took the call to pastor Grace Baptist Church in downtown San Jose, and really spent 8 years there trying on what it meant to be an organizer of that community. And I left that congregation because I got an invitation to work with the national organization that the local groups that I was a part of and organizing, both in Oakland and in San Jose, are a part of this larger network that at the time was called PICO National Network and has since rebranded itself in 2018 as Faith in Action. And so I serve now as the deputy director of the organization. So I partner with our executive director in helping him in a lot of the administrative work of the organization. I still retain responsibility for the development and training of clergy. So for much of my tenure, I was the director of clergy organizing. And so I worked with rabbis, with imams, with pastors and ministers, tribal elders, people who were the spiritual leaders of communities that were connected to our work, and really helping them discover what I was able to discover, the ways in which organizing can be an expression of their faith, and that organizing can be informed and grounded and rooted in their faith and their faith traditions. And even the Prophetic Resistance podcast is another attempt to create a space where people are hearing from leaders of faith and moral courage who are explaining how their tradition, how their practice, how their theology informs their decision to be a part of social justice efforts in the community and in the world.
Really appreciate what you just said about listening, coming to decisions, the looking outward, and planfully and thoughtfully and wanting to bring that to the church. I don't hear pastors talk like that ever. They may talk about fellowship or doing good, but the idea that your faith lives deeply and that there can be both respect from the outside world, whatever that means, and thoughtfulness and true apprehension of that from inside the church, rather than let's go see what people need and throw it at them.
Right.
Churches, at least in my experience, very often act like missionaries. Let's take Tupperware to Africa and see if that's useful to them.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. It's not even that question of let's go see what we think people need. We often even skip that question. We somehow decide what they need, and then
Absolutely.
hope that, if we offer it, they will respond. It's really, really hard, I think, and humbling to start from a place of not knowing, because I think there is so much about the way the church understands itself as it's an authority, and it's a knowing institution. It has truth. We're going to offer it to you, and to approach things the way that I was trying to approach them is to say, actually, I don't know, and what I need to do is listen more and try to ask if perhaps the voice of God is not just in the authoritative church and the pastor of that church, but perhaps God is also in the voice of the people in the community, the people who are on the margins of our congregation, the margins of the community, folks who we don't always listen to. Is there good news? Is there good news not just to tell the community, but to actually hear from the community? That's a fundamentally different posture. And I don't hold myself up as some exemplar on that front, because as much as I am, almost hardwired now to approach things this way, my own arrogance as a dude, as a middle-class person, as a Christian, it's all over the place, and I can walk out in the world, so let me model what it looks like to be humble and thoughtful and ask all these questions, while also demonstrating how incredibly male and middle class and American I really am. But I do find it to be a kind of helpful corrective, the tension that this orientation creates. The point I'm making is that organizing practices can be useful for this kind of work. But even the truth of the organizing tradition that I'm a part of is steeped in a lot of patriarchy and white supremacy, and that itself, it comes with its problems. But I have found that way of trying to think about these things has been helpful. When I counsel other pastors, especially, I'm often asking these questions about what are you hearing in the community? How are you creating space? If you don't mind, I'll just tell you briefly how I tell the story of applying that in the context of Grace Church.
Please.
It's really like, organizing is about, the old school organizing model is one-to-one. So focus on relationships, ask lots of really good questions, understand people's stories, what matters to them, what their values are. That's one-to-one. Step 2 is research. So as you're beginning to identify community problems and issues that need to be addressed, do lots of research. First, to find out what issues people are talking about. Secondly, to find out who are the decision makers and the policies that make that, create this reality, and do lots of really good research. And have the people be a part of that research. So they're becoming experts in their own story, experts in understanding the structures and systems that shape the life that they're living, right? So if you're oppressed because of the way that this state houses people who live with mental illness, you're going to become an expert not only on your experience as a person who lives with mental illness, but you're going to also understand all the other forces at the county, the state, and national level that have an impact on your life. Yes. And so now you're at a point where you can then decide what might be a possible solution, like a policy solution that could change this. Monies that need to be invested somewhere, a commission that needs to be created, a practice that needs to be abandoned, whatever that is. And then you move to the third stage, which is action. So then you take action. The historic quintessential example of that is a big community meeting where all the community comes together in droves, and elected officials are lined up on the front, and people get to tell their stories, and then there's this question that has to get asked, or a series of questions about the support of elected officials to support this thing, and they say yes or no, and we have a response for the yes or the no, and right, and then after that is a season of evaluation and sort of trying to figure out what did we learn here, what did we gain, what are we celebrating, what did we lose, what needs to happen next, and then you're back in the cycle again. I discerned that I could use that same cycle to help the church figure out some of the questions that seem rather mundane but are really important, like how are we really going to invest in the justice education of children and youth in our church? How are we going to honor our elders in this congregation and organize our life in such a way that is thoughtful and respectful and just for them? How is it that this congregation that is pretty pro-LGBTQ, but nobody knows it because nobody says it? Mm-hmm. So how are we going to get to a place where we can say something about that, knowing that one of the reasons why we're not saying it is because we know there are some people who are not on that page. What does it mean that that MichaelRay Mathews is the first Black pastor? Do we want to talk about race, right? If there's any regrets I have from leaving Grace, is that I needed 2 more years to really dig us deeper into that conversation. I ended up getting leaders in our congregation trained to do one-to-ones with everybody in the congregation. And then I brought people together in house meetings, and they were sharing the stories they were learning from their one-to-ones. And they were also naming all the issues that came up, and they included the kinds of things I just named. How are we treating our children? How are we treating our elders? How are we treating people who live with mental illness? How are we clear about our welcome of the LGBTQ community? What does it mean for us to be a truly multicultural congregation? And in that, we started doing all kinds of research. And I would say, at least on the fronts of our relationship with people who live with mental illness, and particularly their encounter with law enforcement, which is not a very different conversation than the one we're having now about law enforcement, and the work around LGBTQ inclusion. I feel that it really, at the end of the day, the backstory is that those were both big organizing campaigns that I helped to lead in that congregation that involved lots of relational work, lots of research, education, space for people to ask questions, and then some really challenging conversations and discernment and decision about who we were going to be as it related to how we faced the stigma of mental illness and how we face the reality of the marginalization of our queer kindred in our community. When I left the church, I said, keep coming back to these questions. I have no idea if that's still a part of the life of the congregation, but that has definitely been the critical and key lens through which I've tried to think about my leadership in the church, and even now in this work. Because believe it or not, even though we teach organizing, sometimes we forget that organizing can apply to a lot of other things that we have to do in this organization that aren't about mass incarceration and rights for immigrants, basic stuff we have to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Benton, I'm trying to give you a place to chime in, not just this church experience, but your whole experience. I think you guys have some things in common in your journey here.
Sure. Well, a couple things that you said resonated with me, MichaelRay. First of all, I too felt the tug of the Spirit when I was 16 into some kind of ministry work. I grew up in a small church in Nashville. It was a fundamentalist church. I wasn't clear on what being called into ministry meant, but I was fairly certain that it meant wearing suits and eating casseroles and going to potlucks and visiting people in the hospital and conducting weddings and funerals, right? And so I started down that road. I went to the local college that was part of my denomination, and it took me exactly 1 quarter to decide that it was not actually the path that God had for me. I was at the time already writing songs, and I had a band, and I was, sharing my faith and my experience through music. And so I began to sort of lean into that, and that has led me to the work that I do now as a musician, a songwriter, and worship leader. But it's interesting how when you feel called, and I'll put that in scare quotes because that's kind of a mystical way to talk about vocation, when you feel called to ministry work, most of us find that road is a meandering one. And as we mature in our faith and as we gain different perspectives, And I know with some of the things you've said and the ways you've reached out to faith communities that are so different from where you came from, I've had the same experience, and it informs me, and it informs what we do as ministers, what we do as proclaimers of the gospel, or what we do as just good people. And so I've found that my journey is much like yours. One of the things that I really admire about your work is how you've been able to reach beyond what's comfortable for you, and grow your boundaries and grow like the Jabez prayer, grow your territory, and that's admirable. Kingdom building is just the most valuable, amazing work whenever we can find commonalities and we can find common ground to talk about and common experiences to draw from. It just makes us more and more aware of how much bigger our God is than we realize. So I think all that's incredibly valuable. Growing up in the South too, I think there's this sense of self and purpose that's grounded in where you come from, who your people are, that kind of stuff, And it's funny because my parents moved away from Alabama when they were still young and before I was born. My mom was barely 22 when I was born, and they kind of created a life that was set apart from their Alabama roots. I think they made a decided effort to do something different, take a different path, for which my sister and I are eternally grateful. Growing up in Nashville was so much better than growing up out in the country in Alabama for us. I think I don't know. I don't know what it would have meant for me, but I don't think I would have ended up here if I had grown up there. So those journeys, the places where we come from and that we carry with us and sometimes have to overcome. Some of that stuff we do have to overcome. But how we take that with us into places that we never thought we'd go as we minister, I think it's powerful the way the Holy Spirit woos us and guides us and directs us and nudges us. And obviously you've listened to the Spirit throughout your ministry career thus far, and it's inspiring.
I come from people who ask the question, who your people?
Yes.
That I really resonated when you said that people care about the land and the people that you're from. I did not grow up in the South either, but because I'm the child and grandchild of the Great Migration, I feel like the South is sort of there sitting as this resource, ancestral resource, if you will, and I'm reckoning with, trying to reconcile.
That language of ancestors, that was not what I expected you to say at the end of that sentence. And the fact that I was anticipating a different ending says so much to me about who you are, seeing it or experiencing it. The way I would have thought about it if I were in your position is something like, here's this character in my background I need to grapple with, rather than, here's this resource of history and voices and strength and overcoming and failure and all those things to draw from. That is a very different perspective than the one that I come out of and hope to be shedding a little bit. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, about the ancestral resource idea.
Yeah, I have to say that it's relatively new language for me to use that as the frame. And I think it's come out of conversations I've had in the past 6 years since Ferguson, but even more intensely since the 2016 election, and even more intensely since the coronavirus pandemic and the murder of George Floyd and the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and Elijah McClain and Breonna Taylor. There are ways in which I've come to a conclusion that these are my ancestors and that this experience of these ancestors is an ancestral resource. In the Ferguson moment, a lot of clergy, especially Black clergy, were reckoning with the disconnect between them and young activists. And the disconnect had to do with age, but also gender and sexuality. It was just, very, very complicated. But one of the things that was really clear is that those young activists were and still are making church for themselves. And some of it is about drawing from resources that look very Christian, look very much like they're from the church or from the Black church in particular. But some of them also go deeper than that. And I want to say deeper and not different, because I think a lot of what has been the Black church experience draws from what I would call a sort of Black spiritual traditions that are not just about the content that comes out of the Christian text and the Christian tradition, that would have been the traditions of those who owned them as slaves, but the wisdom that came from the traditions prior to that. And that still lives. And I think in the past year, I've had several conversations with a number of my Black Christian friends who they've told stories about their interactions with African American elders in the congregation who, on the one hand, would tell you, I don't practice any ancient African traditions. They might even say, I don't do witchcraft, but they actually practice things that are rooted in Black culture and are not necessarily Christian,
right?
But they do them as Christians, do this as someone who is a child of God, who is a follower of Jesus. And there's not a separation for them, which is why they will deny, and have a really hard time with anybody that suggests that this is something distinct from Christianity. And Christianity is complicated anyway. I mean, if you just travel around the world, you see the ways in which culture informs how Christianity is understood and practiced in the world. But I've been taking a harder look in the past year at some of these traditions, and both sides of my family, they show up differently, but they're often about the land. They're often about what comes out of the land, herbs, and they're often about how we care about other created beings. And they're also about how we respect those that came before us. I mean, my family does not use the word ancestor. They don't. They don't. And if I show up and they listen to the podcast and hear me talking about ancestral wisdom, they're going to be, baby, what you mean by that? And then I have to tell them what I mean. And they're like, well, why don't you just say that? What's this ancestral stuff? But for me, I'm clear that that's what this is. This is ancestral wisdom. And it's not, you're right, Elane, it's not just the people, it's the experience. So the reason why I say that this journey probably started back in the Ferguson moment, because I was hearing young activists talk about ancestors all the time, but really it's like in the past year, or really in the past half year, because it was half a year ago that I found my third great-grandmother on a slave record in 1850. It was a half a year ago that I found her son, who I'd already known about, named Green. I happen to be wearing a green shirt today, Green Harkness. Found him on a voter roll dated June 28, 1867, Green Harkness, and his mother, Delcy Faulkner Harkness. The Faulkner piece, well, that's another episode. I have some more research to do, but I began to, try to understand their story, and I don't have a lot of information. But the other thing that I've also been studying is Reconstruction Period, because that's not something I was really taught in school. I wasn't taught in college, even in seminary. You don't really take, church history should be the treatment of Reconstruction and what happened for the United States, what happened right after the emancipation, and all the things that happened to sort of undo what was granted to Black people in that moment. That was, it was like the narrative for me was Lincoln freed the slaves, but then something happened, and then Jim Crow, and then the Civil Rights Movement, and then Martin Luther King, and now we've overcome. Or you might also add the war on drugs, but then Barack Obama, But then if you live to 2016, then you got to say, okay, wait a minute. It's more complex. Our journey seems to be more cyclical than linear, because what does it mean? What does it mean that in 2020, I work for an organization that is fighting for the right to vote in Georgia, when I'm looking at my second great-grandfather's name on a voter roll in 1867? What does that mean? This idea of history being this straight line of progression is very problematic. And so I begin to recognize that, these are cycles, and that the struggle does continue, and we inherit the struggle, and we have to figure out how to participate in that struggle. And if we're going to figure out how to do that, we probably need to understand more about what happened before, and more about the people that were a part of that. And so when I realized this year of an election and a census, that I was able to find these ancestors because of census and voting records, and I'm still fighting. I'm still fighting today. All of a sudden, Delcy and Green are like my best friends. They're like right here next to me. And so then what I'm doing now is very much connected to what happened before me.
Yes.
And I'm saying that without telling you how much of a sci-fi nerd I am and how much I geek out about time travel. Like this,
Right.
I don't need the time travel elements of all the sci-fi I love to get this, right? And then the question for me then, if Delcy and her son Green matter, my third and second great-grandparents, then what I'm doing now must have relevance for my second and third great-grandchildren.
Yes. Yes.
So I'm asking myself much deeper questions about what their lives meant and what that moment meant, what this moment means, and what does it mean for the moment that is ahead. I was talking about this most intensely this season. I've talked about probably every episode since the coronavirus has had some element of this piece. Like I'm sure everybody who listens to the podcast knows the names of my great-grandparents because I keep telling the story. But probably the deepest conversation was with Valerie Kaur, because really this language of ancestral wisdom really comes from her book, The See No Stranger, which just came out. And I interviewed her about the book, and she's talking about ancestral wisdom. And she talks about that through South Asian Sikh religion perspective. And I was telling her, I said, our second and third great-grandchildren are going to be fighting the same fight. Now, you could say WTF about that, right? Like, what? But you could also say then, okay, well, if that's how this works, then what's the wisdom we need to be depositing now?
Right.
That's available to them in that moment that is going to come. And so it is about those individuals, Green and Delcy, and their lives, and I'm still trying to figure out how to learn more about their lives, but it's also like what was happening around them and what was happening in the culture, what was happening in the country, what was happening in the world, and how were their lives shaped and informed by that. There's a lot of depression in that line. And I'm now asking myself different questions about where that depression comes from. This is a season where, as we're trying to unpack white supremacy and anti-Blackness and caste, thinking about Isabel Wilkerson's new book, Caste.
Yeah.
I've been reading the work of Resmaa Menakem, who wrote the book My Grandmother's Hands. He's a trauma therapist, trauma healer. And he basically says, he calls white supremacy white body supremacy, because he says that the trauma of white supremacy lives in our bodies, and that it lives at the cellular level, and that, epigenetics show that we pass this on. So once you start putting in all this science, I haven't got to science fiction yet. Then you're like, okay, I need to think much more deeply, much more thoughtfully, much more creatively about what my life is about and what the lives before me were about. And it's making for an interesting conversation with my mother, because, I'm telling her facts that she didn't know, and then I'm offering her potential interpretations of those facts, and she's just like, I never thought of it that way. So it's making for an interesting conversation between the two of us.
Can I just say that you're having a mother who could say, hey, I never thought of it that way, so much shapes the kind of man you are. Just the idea that she could consider a different way of thinking about something.
Yeah, my mom is like that. I think your observation is spot on, because my mother, on the one hand, is a church lady, has been a PK, she's very proper and she very much follows the rules. She's very devout. That's just her. And we all know that in the family. We all know that, we change our language around her. Like, that's grandma, that's mom. But if you really listen to her and listen to her journey and listen to her talk about how she has navigated the world, there's always been an openness. When she was younger than me, when she was in her 30s, she was part of a young adult group at our church, a young adult Sunday school class that decided they wanted to learn about other religions and other traditions. And they got the deacons all riled up in the church because they were bringing out Muslims and Jews and folks, and my mother was like, I don't understand why it is that you can't consider this. And then, of course, growing up in these white Christian schools, the abortion issue was heavy on the table. Also, issues around evolution were on the table. And I was talking to my mother about evolution, and she said, it's possible that God created us, and then God created us to grow and change and evolve. And, and my mother, she'll say that, and she may even raise that question in Sunday school. But she's going to say, what I really know is what's in this word. At the end of the day, she's going to come back to that, right? That's right. I'm only speculating, right? My mother is a professional woman. So my mother is 76, and she's still teaching nursing. So she's a nursing professor. Wow. She's a smart woman. She understands these things. And so she's always sorting out like what it means for her to live and be true to the faith that was passed on to her. But she also is clear that she can use her mind and her intuition. I thought perhaps the most powerful experience for us was when my niece came out a few years back. The big question was, what were we going to do when the first family gathering included a friend of a beloved of my niece? And that happened. I watched my mom sit down and just get clear, like, if you love my granddaughter and she loves you, then I love you. Now, you ask my mother what she thinks about what the Bible has to say. She's going to say what you would suspect she would say. Right. But she was very clear, right? And thank you for saying that. I woke up this morning thinking I needed to write my mother a letter. I'm trying to figure out the things I wanted to tell her. I think you just gave me some good content to reflect on with her.
Okay, so stepping away from your mom and just thinking about language for a second. Again, we were talking about language earlier on, that you are exploring and claiming language that was new for you. Listen to the difference between bless your heart and I never looked at it that way. Even if you're saying bless your heart, the arrogance of bless your heart versus the humility in the language of I never thought of it that way. I mean, the difference is shocking and huge, and language matters.
Yeah. Well, it speaks to an openness.
Going back to the church piece of this, my experience of white churches, I have some experience of the black church, but it's not personally deep, right? I don't think I've been part of one where there wasn't an underlying arrogance. And I think that's partly the sin in our bones, right? It's partly that it is hard for anybody to overcome our own belief that we are the ultimate authority on everything. Mm-hmm. But I think that whether I'm looking at the fundamentalist or evangelical churches I've known and the liberal churches I've known, there's been this sense that either we're obliged to help those poor people out there, or if those poor people would just come into this building, they'd be golden. Either way, it is just such an us and them. It's such an arrogance.
Yes.
Don't forget, we went to school in Berkeley, where you can be so liberal you're conservative.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the school I attended made me insane for that. And other things, too, but for that, a lot. I mean, it's one of the reasons I spent so much time at your school, right? Because it was a different set of problems.
Very different. In my tradition, my school, we were the far left going straight to hell on a skateboard.
Isn't that funny?
In the denominational tradition.
Yes.
In the context of the consortium, of the GTU consortium, we were the Dark Ages school.
Brandon and I used to talk about how we never prayed at my school. And at your school, it was like, who will start this class in prayer? And it was like all these hands would go up to see whose would go up the fastest. Like, no, I'm the most holy. I can do the prayer. Yeah, but just fascinating, right? So different. So I'm wondering what those of us who are not involved in community organizing, whether we should be or not, how we can start kind of tearing apart those ties among the congregation and from the congregation to its immediate surroundings that allow for a statement like, we don't know. How can we help besides modeling, besides saying it ourselves? I don't know anything about that. I should talk to somebody who does. Like, how can we do that?
Yeah. So I think the first revolution is internal. That's an organizing principle. That just came to me as I was getting ready to say what I'm going to say. I think that the disruption is already available in the pews before you even get to those who are not in the pews and in the community and on the margins of that congregation and on the margins of the society. I think that churches are largely places where we wear masks.
Yes.
No pun intended. Where we have an idea of how we're supposed to show up and what we believe and what we're supposed to say we believe and how we're supposed to worship and how we're supposed to act when we worship and how we're supposed to act when the sermon is preached. And there is a lot of masking that goes on in church. And I don't say that in a way to be critical of church. I just think that that's what happens in human groupings. We just develop ways of being. And I think what's often helpful is the kind of profound and disruptive encounter that creates space for reimagining. When reimagining almost implies that you don't know. And so I want to know. I want to know more, so I'm going to reimagine this thing. So like even with the organizing that I tried to describe, that I was trying to orchestrate inside the life of the church at Grace Church, was one that began with one-to-ones with people in the congregation. Because the number one sentiment, we trained 12 leaders, by organizer trained 12 leaders to do one-to-ones with everybody in the congregation. And every other week we came back to report on the themes of what came out of the congregation, not personal, private information, but the themes that came out of those pieces. Then we hosted house meetings where we shared those themes if people had more. The number one sentiment throughout was, I never knew that so-and-so, who I sit right next to in this pew, I never knew that so-and-so, who I see at these meetings, that was the common phrasing. And so we were breaking up the ways that we understood each other, behind our masks, to really try to get a sense of, so like we had decided that, mental illness was going to be something we were going to take on behalf of those poor people who live with mental illness.
Right.
Yeah. But then when people started to tell the truth about themselves and their families, this was not an issue that mattered out there. It was an issue that mattered in here. Here, like all the way in here, like in my very being, I suffer with depression and anxiety. And so I think that that's critical, that we stop BSing ourselves sometimes and like create some disruption, so that we sort of dig into our own stories and our own journeys. And then that gives us some clue about the conversation we need to be having. Because once we're curious about that with each other, now we can be curious with others. How do we carry that kind of curiosity into the world? So once we started to engage, because, Grace Church used to be the site of a community center. So there was a difference between the community center members and the congregational members. And we talked about each other in that way. And so our goal was to get to a place where we could start talking to the members of the community center who were like literally in the floor below us. Like they weren't very far away. But it took us a while to realize that, we should like have relationships and conversations. But we first had to have that experience internally. I didn't know that till after the fact. Like I realized after the fact that demasking created a way for us to be in relationship with our community that wasn't as paternalistic as it could have been. I mean, the paternalism was going to be there, right? For all kinds of reasons. But I think it was less so and more open because we had that sort of internal revolution. I think there is fundamentally, Elane, this notion that we have to bring a lot of curiosity to everything. And we have to embrace a posture of discernment, not one that says we already know, but one that is constantly seeking guidance and trying to understand what's happening in the world. What I would add to that is that I think it begins with us. That was the first song I played on the piano, was Let There Be Peace on Earth and Let It Begin with Me. I never got to more than one hand playing it though. So. all my musicianship is right here. I didn't get to. My mother does the piano. So.
Well, that enabled you to be able to develop this one.
Yes, it did. Probably the deepest spiritual experiences that I've had are singing, sitting at my mother's piano or my grandmother's piano. Just sitting there, just sitting at the piano and singing. Maybe with the hymn book open, maybe with me tinkering around with, making sure I'm getting that note right with the one hand that I could play with. But it is about tapping into this experience that has been a deep one for me, a deep one for my mother, a deep one for her mother. It's like ancestral, right? It's where I connect. And if there's some piano sitting in the open room and there's nobody around, I'm going to be sitting at that piano, singing my heart out.
Anything else, gentlemen? I feel very satisfied, like I've had a good meal. You know what I mean? You have anything else you want to add or ask or?
Just that I've really enjoyed the chat, MichaelRay. Thank you for taking the time.
So, besides your podcast, could you name some other places where if people want more information or want to engage more or want to learn more, where they should go?
Sure. So, of course, there's the website for Faith in Action, the organization that I serve as the deputy director of, and the podcast is really a project of Faith in Action, so faithinaction.org. It's the place to find out more about what we're doing this season around voting and the census and our continued work to reach out to the humanitarian need for more masks for people who are marginalized. Our Live Free site, livefreeusa.org, is a good site to learn about the humanitarian campaign around masks for the people. I am president of the Alliance of Baptists, historically white Baptist community, came out of the Southern Baptist 30 years ago and been reckoning with race and anti-Blackness pretty feverishly over the past 5 years. And so there's a lot of work that's coming out of body of work that we've been engaging together. So the allianceofbaptist.org is another place to learn more about the kind of work I'm trying to help support and lead. And I guess one other resource people can look at is sympara.org, sympara.org. Sympara is a spiritual community that I helped to found over 20 years ago, I think now. We still continue as a spiritual community that meets monthly for prayer and study, but we started a project that's aimed at looking at how the church engages its assets, primarily its land and its property, in serving the community. Nice. So a lot of repurposing of religious structures. The work of that organization is led by my colleague, Reverend Daniel Pryfogel. So sympara.org is another place. And I serve as the co-founder and the public theologian in residence. Those are all expressions of me and my sense to my call to a theology that lives in public.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Bye.